Welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Dr. Benjamin Tallis. He's a senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, dgap, where he leads the Action Group Zeitenwende, a German word which was invented politically 2 years ago after the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Welcome, Dr. Tallis.
Sergej, a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to see you.
Look, you are leading this research on Zeitenwende, and you know if Germany is ready to accept the responsibility for this war or not, if Germany is ready to provide enough support. German government always say we have provided more than almost anyone. The Ukrainians always say we're terrorists, and we will discuss all these things now. But my first question is, you're also a person who pledges the politician to stick to the concept of neo-idealism. And what is neo-idealism?
Yes, not only do I pledge neo-idealism, I have a claim to have invented neo-idealism as an approach to international relations. And what it is a morally grounded approach to geopolitics, which is based on the power of our values, conceived as ideals to strive for. So things like democratic governance, collective self-determination for democratic societies, fundamental freedoms and human rights, and a thoroughgoing liberalism, and to understand that those things are actually our real interests, and to pursue them actually as our interests. So it collapses this distinction between values and interests that is often made in international relations, and says that if we pursue our true values, our true fundamental interests, then our other interests will take care of themselves. And another key aspect of it is restoring the hope of progress to democratic societies, saying that actually we can have the better model, we can win the systemic competition if we do justice to that model. And that's going to take a bit of work, both internationally and at home.
That sounds to contradict a bit to the debate we had for decades, when we were taught all the time, okay, there are things of Realpolitik, the real politics, when you need to think about what is possible, what is profitable, what brings your economy growth. Sometimes you need to shake hands of some bloody dictators, and there are idealists who think about values but don't have money to fund their politics. Is this approach you mentioned, is it some sort of an escape from this dilemma?
I certainly hope so. I mean, we can ask also how well named realism or Realpolitik actually is, when as much as any other approach it imposes a particular vision on the world and the people in it. How realistic was the approach to Russia that was driven by Realpolitik or by realism? How realistic has that been in terms of securing our societies and actually ensuring the well-being of our people? Now, realists would say it was actually liberals who got us into that mess, but understanding that a key part of realism is that might basically makes right, that the strong can do what they will and the weak accept what they must, as Thucydides had it in the caricatured version. Where would that leave us in terms of Ukraine? That would leave Russia being right on Ukraine and being allowed to do what it's doing to Ukraine, to subjugate the country, to conduct its imperial genocidal war as a matter of course, because that is its sphere of influence as a great power. That's a key part of so-called realism in international relations, and that we should not be interfering in that. And never mind what the Ukrainians want or think. Well, no, say a lot of people, and no, say the neo-idealists. And this is not just an academic endeavor. It's something that comes out of the real world and highly realistic responses to Russia's full-scale invasion, not only by the Ukrainians themselves, but by leaders like Kaja Kallas and Gabrielius Landsbergis in Estonia and Lithuania, respectively, but also in terms of what Ursula von der Leyen's response to this has been about really upgrading the EU's Ukraine policy to say they're one of us and they belong with us. That's changed 2 decades of Ukraine policy from the EU, which I've worked on in one way or another for almost all that time. And this, I think, and a lot of other people now start to think, is a much more promising way that we can not only defend our democracies from the real threats that they face, but also actually renew them and make sure they make good on our promise to be both materially but also morally superior. And that by doing so, we can actually help spread liberal democracy. We can grow the free world in a way that learns the lessons of failures to do so. So that makes us safer, it will make us better off, it gives the hope of progress, and it will be better for other people around the world. Now that is a realistic view of international politics. Simply saying we're stuck in a tragic view where you can achieve no progress doesn't sound realistic to me.
Indeed, we have seen in Germany this debate about the gas supply from Russia, and the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 were built because a lot of people in Social Democratic Party, but also from the other parties, claimed that the cheap gas from Russia is so important, and Putin is not bad after all, and he depends on our money exactly as we depend on Russia's gas. But it ended very abruptly when Russia just turned off the gas, and the price spiked in our economy, endangering our economic and social stability. But now we have the same debate regarding the delivery of weapons to Ukraine, including long-range missiles, towers, when many says once again that you may not make your foreign policy steps based on values. You may stay on the side of Ukraine as much as you want, but you need to calculate the consequences of your steps. And what will you do if Putin will see it as a crossing of the red line? How can we approach this debate in Germany and not only?
Yes, well, on the Nord Stream issue, I think you've put it very well in the past when you refer to this golden opportunity that was seen by German business and by the German government as actually having been fool's gold. Even the national security strategy here in Germany has acknowledged that while Russian gas seemed cheap, Germany ended up paying twice for it. And that's a classic German wisdom in a way: buy cheap, pay twice, except Germany forgot that in its foreign policy. And it's about understanding that pursuit of interests, conceived only really as interests, ends up with a short-termism, a narrow view that doesn't actually properly factor in the consequences that you're talking about. And I would put it to anyone who says we need to think about the consequences of supplying Taurus, for example. I fully agree, and we need to think about the consequences of not supplying Taurus too. And this understanding of non-decision as also decision has not yet fully permeated German policy making in the way that it should. So what are the consequences of not delivering Taurus? Let's be very realistic about this. One is Ukraine is more likely to lose the war. And let's be very clear again and realistic. The worst outcome this year is no longer stalemate. The worst outcome is defeat. That will have huge implications for Germans' security. It will have huge implications for European security in general, and obviously a negative impact, a massively negative impact on Ukraine. Unless we give Ukraine what it needs to shift to active defense this year, we face a risk of collapse. What we're also doing by not supplying Taurus is signaling weakness and signaling that we can be bullied, signaling that we will back down, that we're still self-deterring in the face of Putin's bravado and blackmail, in effect. He's trying to get us not to stand up for our democracies, not to defend ourselves, and not to defend our values and our interests, in fact. So we're signaling that we're playing his game, that we're allowing him to call the shots. That doesn't bode well for our future deterrence, and all of this means we are much likely to face a larger war in Europe, and we're much likely to have to pay a huge bill for defence budgets on the level of Cold War type defence spending of 3, possibly 4% of GDP. And it's not just me saying that. Defence Minister Boris Pistorius said this at the Munich Security Conference as well, that if we fail to properly give the impression that we are deterring Russia, we could face much, much higher defence spending. So I think for anyone who talks about consequences, they really have to factor that in as well. And last thing on that is we've seen that repeatedly there have been no consequences for us of supplying higher classes of weapons to Ukraine. Be that long-range missiles from the UK, be it main battle tanks from Germany eventually, as well as other allies, or the multiple launch rocket systems that were proved so effective back in 2022. So we haven't learned from history in a deep sense, we haven't learned from the recent past, and we're refusing to face the future by failing to deliver Taurus.
Exactly. We have had the same debate before we were about to deliver first the self-propelled howitzers, Panzerhaubitze 2000 to Ukraine. Then we had the same debate about the Leopard heavy tanks. And we had the same debate by any practically delivery of anything to Ukraine. Is it the red line for Putin? And Dmitry Medvedev would post another Telegram message or Twitter message about how he will nuke London, New York, and Berlin. But after all, nothing happens. We just supply our allies in Ukraine with what they need, and the Russians need to accept it. But when
That's
we are
right,
talking,
Sergey. I don't know if you remember that joke that was doing the rounds back in 2022, that it's an unknown property of the Marder infantry fighting vehicle, that if you deliver it within 3 months of the start of a conflict, it triggers a nuclear war. This was one of the the features of that system that's not advertised in the catalog, but seemed to dictate decision making. And you and I can both remember Chancellor Scholz telling the Bundestag that delivering Marder AFVs risked a catastrophic escalation. Well, it didn't. It never did.
exactly, there was his
Never came.
interview of Bundeskanzler Scholz to the Spiegel news magazine when he said that he is so reluctant because he needs to think about the consequence of nuclear war if Germany will be seen by Russia as a war party. But when we are talking about the level of understanding of the severity of the situation among other NATO partners and NATO nations, we have seen recently results of a poll in the European Union, and only less than 20% of people think that Ukraine is able to win this war. Is it a sign of lack of support, or is it a sign that people don't understand that this war cannot be stopped, but only won either by one or another side?
I think it's a complex issue because understanding those figures always means understanding how people reach these conclusions. And it comes as no surprise to me that, for example, Germans don't necessarily think this war can be easily won, and it can't be easily won, but don't think this war can be won if their chancellor is not actually even saying we should win this war. And this is something that perhaps our foreign audience don't necessarily realize as well as we do here. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has still not said that Ukraine should actually win. He said that Ukraine should not lose, and there's a world of difference between those two things, and it is apparent in German policy. Supplying Ukraine just enough not to lose is a heck of a dangerous calculation to have to try and make to calibrate that level of precision is almost beyond, I think, the capability of military planners. Whereas understanding what you need to do to win is very easy. You give it everything you've got. And that's, for example, what the Danish Prime Minister said very clearly in Munich last weekend as well. We are giving our entire artillery to Ukraine. There is more everyone can do. And I would suggest that this goes across many fronts, actually. And I'm happy to talk more about those measures I think we should be taking in a second. But it's clear that also we missed a good opportunity to win this war in 2022. Had we given Ukraine what it needed then to press home the adaptation advantage it had early in the war, this could have been over by now. And Russia could be licking its wounds at home, it could be defeated, it could be deterred, and we would be safe. And Ukraine would be on the road to recovery and on the road to thriving. Instead, we've missed that chance, we dithered. It was strategically irresponsible of our leaders, and we're now reaping the consequences of that, where indeed, rather than stalemate, we could be looking down the barrel of a defeat here, which would make all of us less safe.
But that is exactly what a lot of politicians and experts from the Nordic countries and from the Baltic countries were saying all the time. And you are well connected in the Baltic countries. You have recently received a diplomatic medal for your efforts on this area. And can we say that these countries who have invested a lot of their money and equipment and political influence into Ukraine, that they feel to be alienated by the rest of NATO?
It's very difficult for countries, especially in the Baltics, but also in the Nordics, because they know how much they depend on NATO for their defense. So they're never truly alienated. They're linked. They're fundamentally linked. They're dependent, and they know that. And the need for NATO is why Finland joined NATO, for example, this year. The Baltic states right there on the front line, who could be the first ones to be attacked if Russia decides to go further, and there are indications that it might. So they're not alienated and they're not isolated, but they do feel ignored to a certain extent. And I don't think their voices are being heard in the way that they should. There's not the urgency in some of the other capitals that we've seen in the Baltics. And you know this as well from your travels to the region. When you go to Vilnius, it's a very different conversation than the one we have in Berlin. It's much more urgent, it's much more clear, it's much more certain about what needs to be done here, and not only because the threat is real, but also what that threat means. People in the Baltic states in particular know within living memory what it means to live in tyranny. They know what unfreedom actually means. They know what the costs of losing your democracy are. And I don't think that's as apparent to people in a lot of parts of Western Europe. So the consequences and the impact of this are clear to people. The proximity of the threat is there, but also the clarity of vision to understand what we need to do, not only to defend, but to renew our democracies and to make good on those promises. That's what struck me about the neo-idealists, as I've called them, is it's putting those things together. It's not just a purely self-interested or narrow view of the world. It really connects some very large issues. And they've been providing the example to, I think, the rest of the democratic world in parts. It's not totally consistent yet, but they're working on it. And together with countries like Taiwan, they really show what you can achieve if you put your values first.
And of course, if you live in Vilnius, 30 kilometers from the border to Belarus, you are well within a range of almost every Russian type of missiles. And that makes your mind think a bit faster and clearer compared to Berlin or Zurich, where you are surrounded only by NATO countries and democratic nations.
But this is a false sense of security that Germans have. I mean, let's think this through a second. Often we hear this in Berlin. We're relatively distant. The Russians would have to, quote unquote, come through the Baltics, come through Poland to get to Germany. Well, no. I mean, Russia has a deep strike missile complex that could threaten Germany immediately in the event of any outbreak of hostilities. And if we keep acting like the weakest link, as well as being the key economic link in the chain, then who do Germans think is going to be tested first by that? I mean, this is something that, territorial distance, the stopping power of land is overrated. Even realists, I think, would conclude that. They talk a lot about the stopping power of water, but the stopping power of land is not there. And this is something we have to contend with, that it's a battle of resolve, as Fabian Hoffmann recently put it, as well as a battle of forces. And right now we're losing the resolve battle fast, and we need to get that back. So this false sense of security that people who are territorially slightly more removed have, it needs to be addressed by politicians who need to be honest with our populations about why we need to prepare.
Absolutely, and we know that Vladimir Putin and FSB are well connected in Germany. I cannot imagine how much of sleeping agents we have also inside of our strategic industries and on keynotes. And we can face not only the attacks from air or land or the sea, we can also see sabotage on our companies, on chemical plants, on other critical infrastructure. And then the negotiation offer will come from Kremlin asking us to be not so aggressive against Russia and not so friendly to those small countries who don't deserve to be protected by us, as the Russians believe. But if we expand our view from the European focus to the transatlantic focus, we have seen a lot of development in the United States with a very unfortunate debate in the country political landscape, which blocked effectively support for Ukraine. What is going on there, and is Europe prepared for the outcome of Donald Trump turning to be the next president of the United States?
So first on that, no, Europe's not prepared. We're starting to have a discussion, which is necessary in order to get prepared, but we're still going too slow on this. And honestly, this isn't a new problem. This is something we've been warned about ever since Trump first took office, and even honestly before then, because what is the problem here? It's that we don't have the capabilities to defend ourselves. We got lazy, diminished our armed forces, and became free riders on the US security guarantee and free riders on US security protection. And that meant the nuclear umbrella, so-called extended deterrence, but it also meant capabilities within our conventional forces. And that's something that every American administration since the end of the Cold War, and honestly all the way through the Cold War, was asking us to do more on. During the Cold War we stepped up, and this shouldn't be forgotten. So Germany spending up to 4% of GDP, thousands of main battle tanks, 500,000 people under arms. That was a fighting force fit for a frontline state, and Germany played its role, and because it played its role, it had influence as well, and it had leverage within the alliance. Since then, it's gone downhill and downhill fast, and as I say, it's not a new problem, but it's one that we haven't been able to fix, despite the repeated warnings and despite the European agendas coming out for this. And it's a problem we would still have to fix if Joe Biden wins the election too. We need to go to the Washington summit, the NATO summit in July, with a really credible offer of not only burden sharing, but burden shifting. That has to mean Europeans doing much more for themselves. What does that entail? It means a swift and substantial investment in our defence industry. Massive orders placed under the understanding that they will generate accelerated production. And we hear now of factories in Sweden working 5 shifts to produce ammunition and so on. And that's a country that cares about workers' rights, cares about working conditions, cares about its people. There's no reason why the rest of us can't be doing that if we want to actually produce quicker. So it's not that we can't do anything, it's that we're not doing anything. Now, what does this mean in practice if we don't, and if we continue down the track we're on? I've described this elsewhere as us, particularly in Germany, but also around the rest of Europe, sleepwalking into a perfect storm. Why is it a perfect storm? Because 1, of the way we're letting the war go in Ukraine. 2, because of those capability gaps. 3, because we might not be able to rely on that US security guarantee. And 4, because we are signaling weakness rather than resolve, as I mentioned before. That is really dangerous, regardless of who's the president, but it's that third factor, the US security guarantee, that makes it a very clear and present danger to us if Donald Trump gets elected. And of course, he recently said he would not only not honour that guarantee, but he would actively encourage Russia to attack NATO allies who didn't, quote unquote, pay their dues. So I think we really do have to take that extremely seriously in terms of equipping ourselves, and that means full spectrum, from conventional capabilities to extended nuclear deterrence, how we manage our nuclear deterrence.
That is also the problem which the Russia's war on Ukraine has demonstrated a lot, that the anti-democratic, totalitarian or dictatorial regimes, they unite pretty faster and easier and provide supply to each other much faster than we supply our allies. If every country in the world which is not in alliance with the Western world or with the undemocratic axis of Moscow, Beijing, or Pyongyang, when they think about who you want to have your ally in a case of need, do you want to have Iran or North Korea your ally, who will not hesitate to supply you with the weapons? Of course, they will request some sort of cooperation, maybe money, maybe participation in some international dirty projects, but they will help you in a case you will need. And or you want to have the US or Germany your ally, when they don't deliver you the basic arms, and the arms they deliver, they forbid you to use them on your enemy. Is it a time bomb under our democratic order?
It's an interesting question, but one that ignores the values dimension of this. So you would get that kind of assistance if you're not a democracy. You would get that kind of assistance if you don't care about freedom. You would get that kind of assistance if you do not want to see a free world. Now, that is an alternative model. It's not one I think is better at all. It's not one I think we should be striving for at all. But in terms of the pure material assistance, you're right at the moment. And that is a true shame for the democratic world, the free world, that we are losing the credibility battle to authoritarian states. They're playing to their strengths, which it must be said are limited, but they are playing to their strengths. We, on the other hand, are not playing to ours. And it was notable to hear at the Munich Security Conference, Krišjānis Kariņš of Latvia, the foreign minister, talking about how we're scared of our strength. We haven't embraced our power, and we need to come out of our shadow and actually, as Margaret Starkner, the Estonian foreign minister, put it, get fit for freedom. And that means getting fit across the board. It means getting fit in our defense industry, but primarily getting the mindset that we need, because we have to snap out of this and realize that we're in danger of losing, not only in Ukraine, but we're in danger of losing the systemic competition that is actually what keeps all of our families able to live in freedom. And I was asked in Munich at some point, we were doing quite a lot, and someone said, what keeps you going? And I said, well, I don't want my kids to live in tyranny. It's quite simple, really. It's a very base motivation, but this is the kind of level of argumentation I think we're going to be needing going forward to say that is the bottom line if we don't sort this out. And we have to start getting ourselves, as I say, fit for freedom. We have to embrace our strength. We cannot fear victory. We should be striving for victory.
And that is what many politicians in Germany, in particular, do not believe, which is a realistic outcome of Ukraine losing this war, that our society, even if we would not be occupied by Russia on that way or another, our society will be less democratic because Russia will gain more influence and more leverage against of our parliamentary system, for example. When we come back to the topic you have addressed in increasing influence of European NATO members within the alliance, that doesn't go like pretty parallel to the idea of strategic autonomy, but sounds a bit similar. What is the difference between the strategic autonomy and this increasing of military spendings?
It's a good question. I was never a fan of strategic autonomy as it was proposed because I think it's a dangerous thing for the free world to try and have blocks that are autonomous from each other. I think we should be as united as possible and working together as Europeans, North Americans, Taiwanese, Japanese, South Koreans, free people of the world. And I don't think this sort of multipolarity view where Europe is a bloc that is equidistant between China and the US, which again ignores that values dimension, is helpful. You can never be truly autonomous in international affairs anyway. Every action is actually an interaction. We are fundamentally constituted by our relations with others. That's, I think, the key takeaway from almost any international relations theory. But what it meant in practice was autonomy from the US. Now, you might think that's exactly what we need at this moment because we can't rely on the security guarantee. But what we don't want to be doing is to encourage that process of decoupling and encourage that process of detachment. I mean, that famous old quote about NATO to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. We still want to keep the Americans in. We still want to keep the Russians out, but we need to drag the Germans up. And we drag the rest of Europe up with us. That should be our goal here. And I think rather than strategic autonomy, we should be thinking about strategic agency. How are we able to do more for ourselves? And that's fine if it comes in that wider framework of the democratic world and the free world as well. Because building Europe in opposition to the other parts of the free world, I think, again, doesn't play to our strengths, doesn't serve our values, and fundamentally also doesn't serve the interests that they reflect as well. Nonetheless, the questions that drove strategic autonomy as an agenda still pertain, and they've really been brought into italics by the Trump comments. So bearing in mind that we don't deal with a single individual, we deal with a whole country, we deal with a bureaucracy, even if that individual like Trump is very influential, we have to be able to keep our ties with the US for the longer term. Even if there is some form of divergence, they will still be closer to us than many others around the world. And so autonomy, again, is not the way to proceed. We should be doing more with our friends. We should be doing more with friendly countries as much as we can. We should be trading with them more. We should be opening up industries between ourselves and helping ourselves to the kind of industrial policy that the US has actually taken the lead on and which we should be doing more of in Europe as well. That allows for friendly competition. It doesn't mean strategic competition in the same way that strategic autonomy would imply.
But are there ways to achieve this future in a plausible time? We know that many promises from the EU, like producing 1 million artillery shells, 155mm within a year, or creating the agency for military procurement, which will be so effective that the zoo of different military systems and weapon systems will not be that dangerous for delivering our allies like Ukraine, where the technicians deal with dozens of types of different equipment. But all these promises, well meant, have not been fully implemented. Can we reach this next year, in 2 years, with all the political debates in our countries and changing of the governments from one crisis into another crisis?
We can. We can't do all of it, but we can do enough of it if we start acting quickly. For that, we need to wake up to the threat, wake up to this fact we're sleepwalking into this perfect storm, as I said before. And if we do, I think there are 5 key things that we can do pretty much straight away to get us back on the right track. And so the first of those is find whatever we can to give to Ukraine that it needs. And Mette Frederiksen, again, would be a good example of this, giving all of Denmark's artillery to Ukraine. Give Ukraine what it needs to move to active defense, to allow it to hold the line, build its forces in order to then go on the offensive in 2025, 2026. That, in Germany's case, means giving Taurus, and as many of them as possible. The Taurus cruise missile, which has recently been the subject of another debate in the Bundestag, which has not compelled Germany to deliver this long-range cruise missile. For reasons best known to Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he will not deliver this cruise missile, despite it would be an enormous help for Ukraine. It's not on its own a game changer, but it's part of the process of getting towards the kind of capabilities Ukraine needs to defend itself this year and then go on the attack. So that's the first thing. Get Ukraine everything we can in the meantime to go all in on Ukraine's victory by giving it what it needs to defend. Second, to go about the process to assert the political will of seizing Russian assets, Russia's frozen assets in Europe. Make Russia pay. It's very clear European taxpayers should also be paying for Ukraine's victory because it's in our security interest too. But why aren't we using these assets that are there to make Russia pay for its own defeat after it's cost us a fortune and it's cost Ukraine a fortune in lives? It's destabilized our regional order, so we should make Russia pay. That would also be a really significant sign of our will to go ahead and actually win this war. That asserts the resolve that we say we will do what we need to do to win. Third thing, we need to go as close as we can to get Ukraine an invitation to NATO at the Washington summit. And in the interim, while it has a clear path to membership, to provide meaningful security guarantees beyond these defense pacts that are being signed at the moment to Ukraine. So security assurances that are really meaningful, and we need to make sure we have the capabilities to back those up, to honor them. Fourth, we need to ramp up our defense industrial production. This means a very big injection of money. And in terms of producing for Ukraine, those Russian assets could provide some of this. In terms of producing for Europe itself, we need to issue the kind of bonds that were issued during the COVID pandemic in order to give us the really hefty weight of orders or money to pay for the orders that would allow industry to quickly invest in increased production capacity and to move to increased shifts, etc. Fifth, and most simply, but perhaps most effectively, or what would have the greatest impact, is simply for all of our leaders to very clearly say that Ukraine should win the war. The goal defines the means, and once you've set that as the goal, your government can define the means to win it. And that it would also give the German public and publics around Europe the rallying point to get behind and to really say, okay, we understand what it is we have to do and why we have to do it, so let's go. And that's a way you can embrace your strength and bring it all together. Last point on that is some people might think that arming Ukraine and rearming ourselves to close those capability gaps are in conflict with each other. For me, this is a sequencing issue. We arm Ukraine now to move to active defense, to then go on the attack. So we buy Ukraine time, first of all, by arming it. Ukraine going on the attack buys us time to rearm ourselves. And so we have to be able to think about this in a sequencing issue. If we defeat Russia in Ukraine, it is the single biggest thing we can do to improve our security. It removes the biggest threat from us for the foreseeable future. If we don't, we heighten that threat. So think about that when thinking about what's intention or not.
That sounds as an inspiring thing and understanding of how things are interconnected and how Ukraine's security is a key to European security. As when you said, as Ukraine would lose or will be forced to some sort of stalemate, it will only increase the danger of Russia pressuring us, threatening us, organizing coup d'etats in the NATO members, or trying to buy our political party or politicians and trying to influence us in their own Kremlin interest. That was Dr. Benjamin Tallis. He is a senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, dgap. He leads there the Action Group Zeitenwende, and we were talking about security, about neo-idealism, about NATO, and the perspectives of winning a war against Russia. Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Sergej, thank you very much indeed. All the best to you and to Eric, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
And thank you. And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. If you have your ideas, share them under this video as a commentary, and wait for the new moving interviews.